here he was now, he'd automatically become a German citizen. He was a German soldier, and all this with a background of British subject by birth. The same fate that his uncles and aunts had, the children of our great-grandfather Alexander Aird. They were all British subjects by birth, the ones that were born in Germany. So no matter whether they spoke fluent German and were born and raised in the country, they were in danger of being interned. In fact, Conrad Aird was interned, and his brother Bruce. The remainder of the family had either died by that stage or were working away from Germany or had gone back to England. Anyway, a little bit about the life of my great-grandfather on my father's side, Alexander Aird. Alexander Aird, as a 20-year-old, got married in London, apparently rather suddenly and rather hurriedly, to Janet Keith Aird, also 20 years old. She was the daughter, one of the children of Grandpa Keith Aird, who ran Keith Silks in London as a business. And Grandpa Keith Aird was a good friend of John the Elder, when I believe they lived somewhere near Lewisham in Lee at that time. Or maybe it was Dartford Villas, I'm not sure. But anyway, they married very, very suddenly, and Alexander Aird's father, John the Elder, formed a company with Alexander called J&A Aird, John and Alexander Aird. And it was specifically designed to set Alexander up in business, to set him up in business on the continent, to be the agent for the John Aird projects in Hamburg, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Moscow, in wherever you could possibly think of in terms of major cities around Europe. John Aird the Elder knew very well there was a massive amount of work to be had in that part of the world, let alone what they were doing in other parts of the world and in the UK. So it made sense to send one of his family members out. And, you know, they had 9 children actually, John Aird the Elder. And John, first baronet, was heavily involved in the business at that time as a general manager, more or less, in charge of mains laying when he first took on a management role. And then eventually, of course, he took the whole thing over. So Alexander went off to the first building project with his new wife, Janet Keith Aird, to Copenhagen. They were building, John Aird and Son in the UK were building gas works and waterworks in Copenhagen. So Alexander was there for a couple of years. In Copenhagen, his first 2 children arrived. Agnes was the first child, and I can't remember exactly when she was born, but I remember when she died. She died in 1929. Anyway, his second child was Alexander. Alexander was also born in Copenhagen, and he went off to sea, and he ended up in Vancouver, where he died many years later. So they finished the Copenhagen project, and then there was a massive project about to happen in Berlin in the early 60s, the Berlin Waterworks, which was an English company. An English company formed the Berlin Waterworks. Fox and Crampton were the key company, and they relied on John Aird and Son to do the building work and laying the mains and what have you for the Berlin Waterworks project and many other projects in Hamburg and Frankfurt and around the continent. But certainly the Berlin Waterworks was a British company, and it was headed up by Henry Gill. Henry Gill was the director of the Berlin Waterworks, and he was the director there for quite a few years, even when the British company folded or stepped back and sold it back to the German authorities. He was employed by the Germans to continue the directorship of the Berlin Waterworks. That's quite an achievement for Henry Gill, and Henry Gill was a great man. He brought clean water to the city of Berlin and Charlottenburg at that time, and the city and the country was very, very indebted to him. They built a statue for him. They even named a road in Berlin after him, Gillweg. Apart from being a very sound engineer and reliable man at the Berlin Waterworks, he married one of John Aird the Elder's daughters, whose name was Agnes, and he married Agnes, and they had 3 children. And he also had 3 children from a previous marriage. So there were 6 children in the Agnes and Henry Gill family. Henry was eventually buried in Berlin. I'm not quite certain whether Agnes was as well. But anyway, so Airds were also involved in other projects through people that they got married to, for example. Anyway, after the Copenhagen project, Alexander moved down to Berlin. He had an apartment there for his family. There was about 8 children at that time. And they had a works there. They had probably another shop. I think they were selling bathroom accessories, bathroom suites, sink units, bath units, water closets and what have you. I believe they had a shop in Berlin just for that purpose as well. So they had a few people they employed, and they were involved in the Berlin Waterworks project and various other projects around Germany. So the nature of the domestic situation for Alexander was he would move his family around depending on where the building project was, and very often into a nice hotel or a wellness centre. For example, in Münster am Stein in 1876, my grandfather was born, Waldemar Aird, and he wasn't born in a hospital. In those days, people had their children at home. But the home for the family Aird at that time was a lovely hotel, Kurhaus Schmuck, in Münster am Stein. I've been to Münster am Stein, but the Kurhaus is no longer there. It's very close to Bad Kreuznach in the middle of Germany, close to the river Moselle and the Rhine, and that is where my grandfather was born. And it was because there was work projects going on around in that region, and Alexander moved his family from the Berlin apartment to the lovely wellness centre, the Kurhaus Schmuck, and they were there for probably several months, if not a year or two. 6 years prior to that, in 1870, Alexander decided to move his complete family, there was 8 children at the time, over to Dunoon in Scotland, a holiday resort, a favoured holiday resort of the Aird family, of John Aird and Agnes Aird and other members of the family. The reason for that was the French were on the warpath with Prussia. Prussia was one of the major states in Germany, where Berlin was, of course, and where Danzig, where Gdansk is also was also based. The port of Gdansk was in Prussia, and of course the family lived in Berlin at that time in 1870. And Alexander decided to have his children in a safer environment, so he sent them over via ship with their house nurse, whose name was Susan Cook Lunn. Susan Cook Lunn remained with the family Aird for about 13 years. I think she was partly in Gdansk, she was certainly in Berlin, and probably also in the wellness house Schmuck in Münster am Stein. Anyway, she accompanied the children over to Dunoon, and they spent several months in Dunoon, as far as I'm aware. When it was safe, they they then eventually came back one by one to Germany. So there was a lot of moving around. In the early days it would have been by horse carriage. There was no trains or buses in that sense. So I always had this vision of Victorian times, Alexander, Charles and John the Elder being whisked around the countryside via horse and carriage. Very romantic, the thought of it. And those long journeys that they must have had, you know, staying overnight in inns, and then the horses getting watered and fed, and then the next day they would carry on. It just kind of, it was a fantasy that I was fully into at that time. And so he was moving around a lot. He also brought delegations of people over to England, mayors and planning officers and one or two engineers and the like. He would bring them over to England in small parties that were actually meant to show the various people in Germany and from the various cities in Germany how John Aird had built their pumping stations, their reservoirs, their sewage works, their gas works. And the idea of showing them this great engineering and building that they did was that, of course, that they wanted to get the contract for the city of Frankfurt and Munich and all these major cities around Europe, and the work would then go to John Aird and Sons. So in that sense, Alexander's role as an agent worked very well. Apart from those kind of trips that were planned, and he on a couple of occasions suddenly appeared in London, which alarmed his father, John Aird. And if you read the Charles Aird books, the Charles Aird diaries, in the book, Charles Aird, Deptford, Kingston, and I've forgotten the other name now, Jamaica, no, Toronto, that was it. You will see reference to Charles Aird being visited in Kingston at the gasworks by his father, John Aird the Elder, and he told Charles that he was very concerned. Alexander Aird, in his management position, suddenly showed up, and instead of being on the job in Germany, so to speak. So he had the habit of doing something like that in that respect. A lot of moving around, toing and froing to the various building projects. And eventually, the next major project was in the 1870s, when Alexander was given the contract to do the complete canalization for the city of Gdansk, the port city of Gdansk, which meant that he would need to concentrate his efforts in the city and around the city of Gdansk, bringing in water, laying new mains, building sewage works, and the like. So he moved his family in about 1877 to Gdansk, and he purchased a beautiful property called the Fünfter Hof. There was a series of country mansion houses by the name of Hof. It was in Germany in those days. German was the language. There were about 8 Hofs, and he purchased Hof number 5, a beautiful, beautiful place which I've been to see. It's still standing. It's a National Trust property, and it's in an area called Pelonken in Oliva in Gdansk. Super, super place, lovely grounds in the back of the house, big pond, there were orchards, flowers, needless to say, a lovely ground in front of the house. It would have been a wonderful place to stay.